Yeah, I am excited to be talking about this subject with you all again. This is a topic that comes up regularly now in my daily life after having presented it here at Trinity and then at the convention, at the denominational convention. I get consistent emails and even just the congregation here at Trinity regularly asks me about this topic. So it's really exciting to be opening it up to a larger group of people to allow for better communication around this issue. For the most part, well, you know it. I don't have to remind you that our culture right now doesn't seem to know how to talk about politics in a way that doesn't get to a level of well, almost hatred, or at bare minimum, internal anxiety that removes from us the ability to converse in productive ways. So being able to be a church that says we are something else and the image we give to the world is something else, even when we talk about politics, is more important now than ever. I want to start by, first off, in a conversation like this, I'm reminded regularly about the need for the power of God's Spirit among us. So I want to start us off with a quick prayer. God, thank you for these people who have committed themselves to the work of reconciliation, even in the political realm, in their churches and in their communities. May they be strengthened by your Spirit in their conversations, to speak with conviction and humility in a way that shows the uniqueness of your church in a fallen world. We offer you this time. May we sense your Spirit here. May we respond to each other with the kind of grace and hope that mirrors the triune nature that you hold. We give this time to you. Amen. So before we get into the new stuff from this week, I want to do two things. First, go over something that's going to happen again next month. Go over what we will and won't be doing with this webinar. It's incredibly important because it's very easy to make assumptions about the political positions that I may hold, or assumptions about the political positions of those who ask questions in the comments. So I'm going to start by doing my best to do a screen share. And it seems not to, oh, there we go, now it's working. Okay, so I'm going to have to wait a second on that because it's not working fully. So you're just going to have to stare at my face while I read off the wills and won'ts here. So first off, what we will and won't be doing. We will be pushing against partisan positions. I won't be promoting partisan positions. There's an important difference there. You will feel some pressure from the partisan positions or from any partisan positions that you may hold. And if you're a person who has political opinions, you may likely hold partisan opinions. But I won't be promoting the opposite. I will be explaining how Christians can agree on theology, but disagree on politics. I won't be minimizing the difficulty that is inherent in those differences. Our differences in this place are massive, and they cause a lot of complications for our churches. I will not be downplaying that in this webinar. I will help you be consistent and introspective about your political opinions. At least that's the goal. I won't be giving you ammunition to use against your political enemies. Unfortunately, I think a lot of times when we have conversations about politics in the church, we end up in these partisan fights without even recognizing it. And the conversations lead to just giving more ammo against particular enemies in the political world. I will be challenging you to consider and practice your politics differently, but I won't be arguing for abandoning the political world. Now, with those out of the way, I want to review a bit of what we did last month. It's going to be fairly quick because we have got a lot of content for this month's webinar, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page so that we can move forward, as it's necessary to affirm the statements that were made at the last webinar in order to engage the conversation in this webinar. First, we reviewed an understanding of how Christian standards can align with government and recognized that they couldn't. We recognized that there was a distinct difference between the two, and that the means of Christ, which means the role of the church, the means of the church, is incompatible with the means of government. So the means of Christ are incompatible with the means of government. And what that means is that because Anabaptist Christianity is foundationally nonviolent, non-coercive, and Jesus-centered, government cannot participate in that. Government cannot be nonviolent, non-coercive, and Jesus-centered. Which leads to the second statement. All governments hold their authority exclusively through violence. There is no government system which exists in our world which does not rely on violence as its foundational support for that existence. And its final authority when things get down to the nitty-gritty of who gets to say what and when. To be honest, this has been played out recently in the recent political realm in our federal government as we enter into what many would call a constitutional crisis. And what that essentially means is who has the final authority to put who in jail. What that eventually means is who gets to say no, and then what do you do after they say no? What it always comes down to is where is violence allowed and who holds that sword? So all governments hold their authority exclusively through violence, which is antithetical to the means of the church, which is inherently nonviolent, Christ-centered, and as such, non-coercive. Now, before I move on, I want to pull that all together to say this. Here's the statement. We can't hold government to Christian standards because government has its own standards. If all government, then we'll move on. So if all government gets its authority exclusively through violence, how are we supposed to be involved in government action? Our involvement in government must be focused on holding government to its God-ordained role. This is unique from the idea that many Christians tend to, from whether we're talking about mainline or more left-leaning Christians, or maybe more evangelical right-leaning Christians. This is quite different from how they tend to engage the government, which is to try and get it to reflect somehow a particular ethic of the Christian church. This is stating that there's a particular role the government has, which we are to hold them to, which may not align exactly with what the church's role is. Well, may not align at all with what the church's role is, not exactly. Because of the fact that it's violent and we believe in a non-violent church, then there's no way that it can align. So our involvement must be to focus on holding the government to its God-ordained role. So I'm going to keep the screen share on for a second so that you can see just a bit of a few verses essentially on this matter. Now, I know if we wanted to, we could go into a deep Bible study on this, just over and over again, talking about all the details of each one of these areas. And that would take, well, a very long time. It would be worthwhile to do. And I encourage you to spend more time in these verses. Right now, we're going to read through 3 sections of scripture to get an image from the New Testament on what the government exists as to start this conversation. So first, 1 Timothy 2, verse 2. Pray for kings and everyone who is in authority, so that we can live a quiet and peaceful life in complete godliness and dignity. So what does this statement, this verse in 1 Timothy tell us about the authority? We are to pray for kings and authority. Essentially, we are to pray for our governments, right? So that's what this says. But it has a very specific purpose for the prayer. It says we should pray for them so that we can live a quiet and peaceful life in complete godliness and dignity. One part of the role of government then is to create a situation in society to allow for this. So one piece of this is that government exists to allow for a quiet and peaceful life. All right. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 14. For the sake of the Lord, submit to every human institution. Do this, whether it means submitting to the emperor as supreme ruler or to governors as those sent by the emperor. They are sent to punish those doing evil and praise those doing good. So now we're getting into far more complicated territory. If this doesn't make you uncomfortable yet, then you probably haven't been watching about what some governments can look like. Submitting to every human institution for the sake of the Lord is a big statement. In fact, this becomes complicated when we note the type of person who would be writing this. What happened to the apostles in the early church? What was their experience with what the government wanted to do to them? Well, let's keep going here. Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. And I would assume that if you know much about Romans, you would expect that these verses would be coming up. Every person should place themselves under the authority of the government. There isn't any authority unless it comes from God. And the authorities that are there have been put in place by God. So anyone who opposes the authority is standing against what God has established. People who take this kind of stand will get punished. The authorities don't frighten people who are doing the right thing. Rather, they frighten people who are doing wrong. Would you rather not be afraid of authority? Do what's right, and you will receive its approval. It is God's servant, given for your benefit. But if you do what's wrong, be afraid, because it doesn't have weapons to enforce the law for nothing. It is God's servant, put in place to carry out his punishment on those who do what is wrong. That is why it is necessary to place yourself under the government's authority, not only to avoid God's punishment, but also for the sake of your conscience. You should also pay taxes. Let me catch us up there, sorry. You should also pay taxes for the same reason, because the authorities are God's assistants concerned with this very thing. So pay everyone what you owe them, pay the taxes you owe, pay the duties you are charged, give respect to those you should respect, and honor those you should honor. So, how many of you are slightly terrified? My hope would be at least some. This sort of question, these verses are so often used in a way that I think has been damaging to people, that we get the knee-jerk internal response of rejecting the very idea of them. But I think that's because we probably haven't taken the time to think about what the situation is, even for the people who are writing this. Because it's true, we know that if we're not cautious around these verses, it can lead to some terrible, terrible outcomes. People who are not doing anything wrong end up in prison or worse. And people who are doing something wrong may be elevated to all sorts of levels of authority in government. So how is it that verses like this can exist at the same time? I mean, think about what happened to Paul, the most prolific author of books in our New Testament here. What happens to Paul in this scenario? What happens to most of the apostles? What happens to the early church during the times under Diocletian and others when there's heavy persecution? When they submit to the authority of the emperor, as is stated here, they end up put in jail because they're servants of God. How can these verses work at the same time as the people who are doing the opposite? The author of Romans is saying, submit to the authorities, and the authorities don't want the author of Romans writing any of it. So how do we end up in a situation where an author can say, this is what we're supposed to do, submit to these authorities, while also themselves not submitting in the way that we might declare it today? What I would note is that it's important to look at this as not a declaration that all government is fulfilling its role at all times. The actual statements that are made here are about how government should be acting. These statements are about how we should be responding to the government while we call it to actually behave in the way it's supposed to. We see this throughout the New Testament. We see this throughout the early church, who would say, your persecution of us is unjust. One of my favorite quotes from the Christian Witness to the State is this: the state has never has a blanket authorization to use violence. The use of force must be limited to the police function, i.e., guided by fair judicial processes, subject to recognized legislative regulation, and safeguarded in practice against its running away with the situation. Only the absolute minimum violence is therefore in any way excusable. The state has no general authorization to use the sword independently of its commission to hold violence to a minimum. The definition then of what the government is called to do is to hold violence to a minimum. The best way, the shortest way, is probably to say government exists to limit evil. That's an important declaration. Government exists to limit evil. That word is the key part right there, limit. Government does not exist to eradicate evil. And it's a pretty logical explanation as to why that is. As we've already noted, government is inherently violent and coercive. Government can never be free from evil because its actions are such. All it can do is limit evil. It can never eradicate it at all as long as it's using violence and coercion to limit such evil. The only way that evil is truly eliminated is through the willing submission to Christ and the image of God's Holy Spirit moving in people. Government can only limit evil, not eradicate it.